Introduce myself. I'm Olivia. I'm a student at UMass Amherst. We're going to be talking with Mark tonight. So welcome to tonight's event. This is sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And yeah, I'm a journalism student at UMass, like I just said. And we're really excited to have the Boston Globe's Mark Arsenault here with us tonight to discuss his new book, The Imposter's War, the Press, Propaganda, and the Newsman Who Battled for the Minds of America. So very powerful title. The book chronicles the history of the espionage and infiltration of American media during World War I and the links the Providence Journal editor John Ratham went to expose it. However, there was one major issue. Ratham was a de facto spy, and most of his work, which helped propel the US into World War I, was fake. So Mark, thank you for joining with us for tonight.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So to start it off, I have a thing of questions here that I was going to ask you. So let me pull those up. So I think just to start this off, really what made you decide to kind of start with the story and, want to tell it now, considering this is dating all the way back to World War I?
Yeah, well, I've been kind of fascinated with John Ratham for quite a long time. I used to work at Providence Journal, where he made his biggest name as the top editor there from 1912 to his death in 1923. He was, in his time, briefly the most famous journalist in America. He was also a liar, a grifter, an extortionist, and an imposter with a fake name. It's not his real name, and a made-up biography of heroic events, almost none of which actually happened. And the way he became so famous is during the years before World War I, 1915, 1916, before the US got into the war in 1917, while the war was going on in Europe. Ratham published a string of just sensational news articles in the Providence Journal that were republished in newspapers across the country and pretty much in every state of the country, many of which were published on the front page of the New York Times, word for word, as Ratham had published them. And these stories were about German propaganda in this country, German espionage, and even economic sabotage and old-fashioned blowing things up sabotage. He got these stories from sources, mostly supplied by a lot by British intelligence, some from another domestic spy group made up mostly of foreigners from provinces in Austria-Hungary, which was ally of Germany in World War I. And a lot of the stories actually, in fact, did check out when I checked them out later. He became extremely famous doing this, shot himself into the stratosphere of American civil society. I got onto this story when I was a Providence Journal reporter in 2004. It was the 175th anniversary of the newspaper. So I was asked to write a special section, or work on a special section with another reporter on the history of the newspaper. So that's a pretty big topic. So the first thing we did was look back at what they had done 25 years earlier in the late 1970s at the 150th anniversary of the newspaper. And those guys were completely enamored of Ratham and had done a lot of pretty good work on him, and enough to know that he was probably not born under the name Ratham, and that he was he had lived his entire life in Providence, and in fact, his entire life in America under a false name. He was an Australian immigrant. He admitted that about himself. That's about the only thing about himself that was true in his own biography. So I was fascinated by him. We did as much work on him as we could at the time. We wrote the special section, but I kept it in my brain for years. Boy, there really should be a Ratham book, and it's kind of surprising that there isn't one. In 2018, I did a short piece on Ratham, just one particular scandal, and he had many of them. But one particular scandal, I did a short piece on it for Globe Live, which is the Boston Globe's live storytelling theater event. In fact, there's one coming up in June, and I'm going to be in that one as well. And so I wrote an original piece on Ratham. I performed it in front of an audience, and people seemed to really like it. And that I think, rejuvenated my obsession about Ratham, and really kind of was the kick in the butt I needed to get me to start working on this as a book. So I started working on it probably in 2019. I started working on the proposal. I finished the proposal. I was so lucky in February of 2020, right? COVID was a thing we knew about. We thought it was in Seattle. It was in fact everywhere. I managed to get to the FDR Library, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York, where I did some really critical research that I needed for the book, and without which I'm not sure I could have finished the book. Right after that, the entire world shut down. The library shut down essentially for 2 years with their researchers. So if I didn't go when I went, I may still be working on this. I spent for pretty much the entire pandemic writing the book.
Yeah, that's awesome. And do you feel that, I guess, with the pandemic happening back then, like, do you feel like it helped in a way because you were able to kind of sit down and focus, or do you feel like you would be in a different place?
Weirdly enough, I think it was a lot easier to write it during the pandemic, right? There was some reporting aspects that were difficult. I desperately needed a particular issue of a newspaper from 1903 in Chicago, when Ratham was a reporter at the Chicago Record Herald. I desperately needed that paper. This was before vaccines. I called up the librarian there, the reference librarian, and said, I don't even know if you guys are open or if I can even get there, but if I could get there to Chicago, can I get my hands on this newspaper? And half hour later, he wrote me back and said, here, I just scanned the whole thing for you. And there it was, the entire newspaper just scanned for me everything that I needed. I just never been so grateful for research being done like that I didn't even ask him for that. He just said, hey, here's a writer who needs some help, and he helped me. I got a lot of help again from the Toronto Public Library. I hired a researcher up there to pull some things for me that I desperately needed I couldn't get otherwise. I did a lot of research online. Newspaper archives now. A lot of stuff's been scanned and digitized. Character searchable, which did not exist, 15 years ago when I was first considering Ratham. I don't think I could have done this same book 15 years ago because that didn't exist. I found a trove of Ratham material at the National Archives. Again, most of that also was digitized. And these things have been declassified for, probably decades, but no one had ever looked at these documents from the point of view of Ratham. People, he interacted with the FBI. So people writing about the FBI looked at these documents. He interacted with Franklin Delano Roosevelt early in Roosevelt's career. So FDR writers, of which there are, many, they looked at these documents, but no one really looked at them the way I looked at them. And so I feel like that was bringing something very original to this book. And then again, Ratham was Australian. He was born under a different name, a different identity that I would rather not say. It feels like giving away the mystery at the end of the book. But I did crack that mystery, and I did figure out who he was and why he invented a new identity to wear like a costume every day for the rest of his life. And so I did a considerable amount of research in archives in Australia, and they have fantastic online resources there. I think they're government supported. They're fantastic. And I was able to go back and read newspapers from, anywhere in Australia, going back, well into the, middle of the 19th century, reading them in their original format, scanned, and that was extremely helpful. And I also got super lucky and connected through a lot of really serendipity with Ratham's long lost relatives. He had no children that we know of, but these people were descended from the same tree as him, so they are his long lost relatives. Their name is not Ratham, that's a made up name as far as I know. But they were delighted to help me, and they had people in their midst that were very equipped to help me. As a genealogist in the family that was just a lifesaver. There's another member of the family who researches and writes historical nonfiction. He had never written about Ratham, but he had written about other members of the family that were extremely helpful. And of course, those people are thanked in the acknowledgments in the book. So, I mean, that's how I reported it. The fact that my wife and I took COVID very seriously. We didn't go anywhere. So every weekend, every vacation, nothing else to do but work on the book. So in that sense, I probably did it quicker than I could have done if it was before or after COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, talking about all this research, seeing that in World War I, Germany spent a lot with trying to infiltrate American media, industry, government, all of that. So I guess connecting it to nowadays, do you feel that there's a similar attempt here with Russia trying to influence American media and kind of seeing a parallel, or is that?
Yeah, no, that's why I think when I did that short piece on Ratham, that sort of re-energized me and sort of kicked off the working in earnest on this book. That was the theme of it, right? News, fake news, real news, what's fake, lies, the sort of the commingling of the two. How do you tell the difference? That was sort of the theme of that, the larger theme of that piece. And I sort of kept that in mind throughout this entire book. I'm not really don't read a lot of history, certainly don't read any academic history. I only read history that's built on stories, which is how I had to build this book. It's built on individual stories, individual scenes that you can draw lessons from and make parallels to today. And what the Germans did to America in 1915 and 1916 is exactly what the Russians did to America in 2016 and are doing now. Frankly, and that includes this exact same propaganda techniques. Great propaganda stuff formatted to look like news that, we see it comes, you can't spend 5 minutes on Facebook without seeing some kind of great propaganda. It looks like news. It's got a headline like news. It doesn't have any sourcing. You don't know where it's from really. And people pass these things among themselves on Facebook like an STD, right? And that's what the Germans did to us. False flag operations. Russia, how the Biden administration specifically warned that Russia was planning false flag operations to justify an invasion of Ukraine. And the Germans did that to us as well, with false flag operations, trying to trick American media into printing things that were derogatory to the British. So we've definitely been through this before. Just now the tools are a lot more sophisticated.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, going into more who John Ratham was, it didn't really seem like he, fabricated his stories, but also just like himself as a person. So, were you really able to uncover anything just about him in general, such as like his educational background, or just the actual name that he had and that wasn't fabricated?
Yes. Yes, I solved them, right? So again, I feel like it would be spoiling the book to give that away here, but I will just say, yes, I presented what I find is compelling evidence as to who Ratham really was and gave my best shot after spending so many years with him as to why he created this new identity. So I'll say that what I definitely can say is he arrived in North America first in British Columbia in the late 19th century and was immediately started working as a journalist. He was, his entire career is sort of contained two elements, right? And everywhere he went. One was brilliant writing. He was an absolutely remarkable, brilliant, thoughtful writer. And that's why he kept getting so many chances, because the other element of his life in every place he was scandal. Those things went together constantly. He was a criminal on the one hand. He was a grifter and an extortionist, in fact. And he had this little scam he used to pull when he was a reporter beginning in British Columbia. He would write a piece. He worked for a little paper in Victoria. He would write a little piece about someone in town, extremely derogatory, negative piece. He'd bring it to that person and say, look at this draft I just wrote about you. Look at this thing. Isn't this thing terrible? You would hate to see this published, wouldn't you? But for a small fee, I'm happy to buff off some of these sharp edges. And for a larger amount of money, I'll just throw the whole thing away. Up to you. And of course, the magnitude of the sin against journalism here is almost incalculable, right? But at the same time that he was a criminal in that sense, he was also a crime fighter. He did, while in Victoria, remarkable stories about the trafficking of young girls into prostitution, mostly immigrants coming from China. There's a lot of Chinese immigrants at the time coming to British Columbia for work on railroads. And these men brought their families, and the families lived around Victoria, Vancouver Island, that area. Victoria had a pretty thriving Chinatown at the time. And Ratham uncovered trafficking of young Chinese girls. And his writing about it is so powerful that even reading it now, like 125 or so years later, I mean, it's enraging, this thing that he uncovered. So that's why he kept on getting chance after chance, right? Because in his mind, as long as he filled the scales of justice with an equal amount of good to balance off the evil, and it was roughly in balance, then he was good with it, right? He ended up leaving British Columbia just ahead of the police coming to arrest him because he had pushed his extortion scheme a little bit too far, one too many times. And he took a ferry over to Washington State. He worked in Pacific Northwest for a few years. He was the editor of the small paper in Astoria, Oregon, in the mouth of the Columbia River. And as far as I can tell, my research says that he employed his blackmail scheme, his extortion scheme regularly. Got fired from there and eventually ended up at the San Francisco Chronicle, where he developed a remarkable, fantastic reputation, became like an ace writer on that staff. Was sent to Cuba to cover the Spanish-American War and wrote sort of just very moving, emotional dispatches, especially in the wake of the Battle of San Juan Hill, which he witnessed, and his account of the aftermath of that battle, not the battle, the aftermath, when what was left were broken and wounded men. They're just a remarkable piece of writing, and I quote it at length in the book. But again, in San Francisco, scandal. He started having an affair. His wife, his lover, and Ratham. This love triangle was exposed in newspapers across the country when someone involved in the triangle tried to frame someone else for attempted murder. It was like a tabloid TV scandal. But the newspaper writers of the late 19th century definitely did their best with it. And that was the first time that Ratham's name ended up spread across the country. The New York Times ran stories about this poisoning scandal in California involving the newsman, John Ratham from the San Francisco Chronicle. He went to Chicago after that. Every time he had a big scandal, he had to quit and move somewhere else. Went to Chicago next, worked there for a few years, but then briefly left journalism and worked for essentially a black propaganda company, writing by black propaganda, I mean propaganda that purports to come from one source, but in fact doesn't come from that source. So it's intended to trick the reader. And he had to write that as fast as he could in service of the most powerful corporations in America at the time, which were the railroads. Once that scheme was sort of uncovered, it didn't really work anymore. And the lesson that Ratham took from this, of all the lessons he might have taken, the one he took was, if you're going to do propaganda and try to deceive people or try to affect people's opinions and minds, they can't know where it's coming from. That's the lesson he seemed to take. He was job hunting in New York in 1906 when he heard that the Providence Journal in Rhode Island had lost a bunch of staff to a crosstown rival that was trying to basically destroy the paper. So they really needed experienced hands. He went to Providence and he left with a $200 advance and an offer to become managing editor. And he worked in that job for 6 years until he was promoted to the top editor, and he just ruled the place with an iron fist until his death in 1923.
Wow, yeah, and just I was gonna follow up with a quick question about, how did he even get into journalism when he arrived? Well, there's a question in the chat about what's the biggest difference between writing historical nonfiction where none of the characters are alive and there are no live quotes versus doing what's considered quote unquote regular journalism.
You mean the difference between historical nonfiction and just what I do now, what I do every day at the Globe, right? Well, obviously you can't interview anybody, right? I mean, Ratham's been dead for 99 years, right? There's no one left to work with him. There's probably very few children of the people left to work with them. So you're left with records, and that's not a bad thing, because sometimes the records that are available are really excellent and you can get a lot out of them, right? There's a scene in the book early on, it's actually in chapter 1, where a German diplomat named Karl Boyed is leaving the United States. He had been stationed in the United States as the German Empire's naval attaché to America. He was leaving in disgrace because the Woodrow Wilson administration determined that he had crossed too many lines and was really more of a spy than a diplomat, and was engaging in propaganda and espionage in the United States. So he got kicked out. This is the end of 1915. There's an amazing scene where he's leaving onto a ship which is docked in Hoboken, New Jersey, and there's a crowd of reporters there to see him. And in this crowd, people are demanding interviews. He's trying to go through the crowd, a wedge of really big, beefy stevedores trying to make a way through the crowd so he can get to the gangway. He's looking around, kind of frightened by all the activity, looking, as one reporter wrote, like he was trying to find something to climb. He gets to the end, and there's 40 reporters there, and they're firing questions at him. And he pulls from inside his coat a statement written in red ink. And he says, I think there are enough copies to go around, but I want to make sure the Associated Press man gets one. The AP being the premier wire service even then. But there were not enough copies to go around. And in the mad rush to get some, there was some pushing and shoving. His hat was knocked off, and the lip of the fedora clung kind of comically to his ear. It just sort of hung there. Then other passengers on that ship thought the ship was leaving, and they started pushing their way forward. And security for the steamship line had to push them back, and they're yelling, "Get back, get back!" And finally, Boyed has had enough. He goes up the gangway. He says, "Goodbye, I am gone," and he disappears. That entire scene comes from, I got that entire scene from newspaper reports at the time. There were 40 reporters there. I found about 5 versions of the exact same scene. All these people seeing different elements of it. And from all those scenes was able to put together, my master scene of Boyed's leaving the United States. It's a really critical moment in the book, and I was able to find the detail through all those newspaper accounts to write a really rich scene that makes you feel like you're there. And you can find that I think on almost anything. I mean, the records I found in the DOJ, Department of Justice records I found in the National Archives were absolutely rich with detail and even conversations. Ratham and the director of what is now called the FBI were friends, certainly friendly, The FBI ended up turning on Ratham later on after the US got into the war. But they were certainly friendly in the beginning. Ratham didn't know it, but the FBI director reported some of their telephone calls and some of their in-person conversations. Those transcripts were made of that, and those transcripts exist. So we have actual conversations between John Ratham and the director of what was then called the Bureau of Investigations, the FBI. And so there's a lot of stuff to work on. It's really a lot of the same stuff that we work with today. Today, we just have the added advantage of living people who may or may not want to talk to us. So, I mean, that can certainly be an advantage. Would I love to go back in time and spend an hour talking to John Ratham, if nothing else, just to see his mannerisms and his affect and to hear the timbre of his voice? Like, absolutely. But, you know, absent that, there's still an awful lot to work with. So I don't find it really that much different. We still do the same thing, except now we have, you know, the added benefit of access to living people. That was a really long answer. I'm sorry. It was really, really long.
No, all good. It was a question from the chat, so that was great. Kind of to shift gears a bit though, and more asking about you. In 2014, I'm looking here that you wrote in the Providence Journal saying no lie was too outrageous for Providence Journal editor John R. Ratham. So, you know, in relation to that, talking about how he reported that the paper's wireless station had intercepted secret German communications, the journal had planted agents in foreign embassies. You know, going off of that and other stuff that he had told, what did you find to be were some of his most biggest and like most sensational lies?
That's an excellent question. So after Ratham's goal in writing the stories that he did, which were purely anti-German, period. He was not interested in getting the German point of view or writing about British efforts to run propaganda in the United States. He was part of those efforts. He was anti-German. I think his readers priced his anti-German bias into their evaluation of his work, right? Later on, after the United States is committed in the war, so mid-1917 by this point, Ratham began a really ill-advised speaking tour of major cities in the US and Canada. It started in Toronto in June of 1917. The US had just declared war on Germany a couple months earlier. And Ratham hinted in the title of his speech that how he was going to say how the Providence Journal had gotten all these scoops. So there was a huge buzz. He rolled into Canada like a conquering hero, got whisked around by the mayor. He got the key to the city council cheered for him. He gave a speech in front of several hundred journalists at the Canadian Press Association, and proceeded to drop every jaw in the house by spinning these incredibly fabricated stories about how he, operating as the commander of a counter-spy operation using reporters, Providence Journal reporters, as counter-spies, John Ratham had infiltrated the German consulate and embassies. You know, his men and women had stolen documents, had copied secret cables, had eavesdropped on diplomatic conversations, brought that information back and turned it into news stories. Now, people did do those things, but not John Ratham's people. There were people commanding counter spies who were infiltrating the consulates and stealing documents and overhearing conversations. You know, not John Ratham, and they were not Providence Journal reporters. So he is a kind of a weird kind of plagiarism where he plagiarized the acts of other people who really his sources. He plagiarized their acts and put himself in their place as sort of the heroic front man. Now, these spies were not going to raise their hand and say, no, that's not true. We did that. He didn't do that. They had to remain secret. So John Ratham made himself extremely famous with these speeches. They were an absolute smash, a sensation. He brought this speaking tour through, some of the biggest ballrooms in New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Toronto, Philadelphia, and everywhere he went, reporters were begging for his time, and these heroic falsehoods starring John Ratham were seeded across the world over the news wires, delivered to front doors and coffee counters in every state and territory in America. He became known, it became his nickname. We get the nickname, the German spy hunter. And so these heroic falsehoods eventually were his downfall, right? They got him in a lot of trouble with the Department of Justice, right? He was claiming credit for all kinds of heroic deeds, fighting espionage and sabotage. Some of those deeds were done by government agents working for the Department of Justice, which didn't like Ratham hogging that credit, right? Also, Ratham, whenever he went into a city, he used to say, like, this city is infiltrated with more Austrian and German spies than any other city I've ever been to. Every city he went to was the worst he'd ever seen as far as infiltration of German spies. And that reflected poorly on the agency whose job it was to round up spies, which was the Department of Justice. So they ended up, Ratham knocked their nose at a joint, and that's when the Department of Justice went from collaborating with him, sharing information with him. Information went both ways. Gossip, rumor, information, good reporting went both ways. Ratham delivered it secretly to the Department of Justice through the head of the FBI. The head of the FBI would pass things back to Ratham. It was a symbiotic relationship until it kind of went off the rails. But if you just, we have a second, we can do this. I just want to mark this passage because I was hoping that this would come up. So this is Ratham on the lecture tour, right? And I have a verbatim selection from a transcript made at the time, a stenographic transcript made at the time of one of his heroic falsehoods starring himself and someone working for the Province Journal, which in fact did not happen this way. So the setup is, at the time, America's not yet in the war. The war is going on. Britain, which has the world's biggest, most powerful navy, has a naval blockade around Germany. At the time, any shipping from a neutral country coming to Europe would be intercepted by British ships, warships, directed to a port the British controlled. Falmouth was used frequently in this way. Searched for contraband, anything that didn't want to get smuggled to the Germans. So if you had bombs or rifles or shells or artillery on your ship, it probably was going to get confiscated by the British. Then they would let the ship on its way. So the setup is this: Germany needs to get some secret documents back to Berlin from New York. They pack it in a secret packing case, and they're going to smuggle it into the hold of a steamship, which would be heading to Europe. And they figure in the hold of this ship, who's going to notice one more anonymous crate, right? So a woman, that's according to Ratham, a woman who worked for the Province Journal, who had been placed in the Austrian consulate undercover as a stenographer, figures this out and then figures out a way to mark the box so that the British could find it and hold that ship. So this is Ratham telling this to a big audience in Toronto. The day this box was to be finally nailed up, this young woman, under instructions, stayed late and ate her luncheon at the office. There were only 2 or 3 people left in the office during the lunch hour. One of them was Captain von Papen, the German military attaché, a man with a weakness, like a good many of us, for beauty and talent in feminine form. This young lady answered that description, and Captain von Papen proceeded to make love to her, sitting on this box, a packing case some 3 or 4 feet square. We could not possibly stop the box on this side, so the only thing we cared about was to identify the box by marking it so that the British officers in the first port of call could get it from among the hundreds of other articles in the hold of that ship. This young lady, taking out a heavy red crayon pencil and listening to Papen's advances, drew sentimentally 2 large red hearts on the top of that box. And it was Captain von Papen himself who took the pencil and put the arrows through the heart. Of course, I can imagine him pausing at this point as like the story sinks in. And then, the punchline, the British authorities informed us, and we have their word for it, that was the method of identification of that box when it reached Fountain. Right? Did this story actually happen? No, it did not. Ratham heard the story from a spy that he was in league with. That spy later said that the real story involved a Czech woman who was undercover in the Austrian consulate who had charmed the consul general. I don't know if that's true. The US government tried to vet this story in 1920 and never could. I think it might be too good a story to be true, but that was the kind of stuff that Ratham used to spin on the lecture tour. Again, it made him incredibly famous, and people were scared. The United States was entering a war in Europe. People were sending their sons 5,000 to 6,000 miles away to fight and perhaps die on a battlefield in a place that they had never been and probably would never go. It was a really frightening time. And what Ratham did was create for America a hero, right? A character of a hero. He was already playing a character. He was an actor. John Ratham was not his name. He was playing a character. He was playing a journalist with a swashbuckling resume, most of which was made up. So it wasn't that big a leap to him, I don't believe, to then go to the next level and play a much bigger character. And that's what he did. And he spun these tales to the adulation of America until the Department of Justice decided to bring him down.
Yeah, that's great that you kind of already answered the next question I had, which was I was going to ask, what really made him such a celebrated figure? And you kind of talked about that, like how he was kind of seen as this like hero and character, and a lot of people being scared at the time. And I saw that he was named a director of the Associated Press, and he was also president of the New England Daily Newspapers Association. So
Yep.
kind of, I guess, just this persona he was able to craft.
He was in person. It's funny because in the newsroom, he was a pretty tough boss, right? He hated laziness. He was definitely not lazy of all the things that he was. He was a fanatically hard worker. He slept 6 hours a night and spent every other waking moment trying to expose stories about the Germans and get the United States into the war. It broke his health. He died at 56. So he didn't like laziness. He used to explode when something went wrong, and these floor stomping tantrums. His first secretary had to be replaced because she just couldn't handle his energy. But he also was really capable of incredible humor. He could make any person laugh at any time, according to the people who worked with him. He was an excellent writer and wrote a lot of really gentle, lovely poetry about love and nature. Much of it was published in national magazines such as Scribner's, big mag at the time. And he was capable of real sentimentality. There's a couple stories I learned where reporters would be brusquely summoned to the editor's office and thinking, oh God, I'm going in to get my ass chewed off. And instead of an ass chewing, we're given a pay raise or a time off and surprise time off and free train tickets to go visit relatives out of state, and that sort of thing from Ratham definitely generated a lot of loyalty from his staff. But again, the staff didn't have any idea where Ratham was getting his unbelievable scoops, right? One of the British agents that Ratham was in league with told him that he ought to convince Ratham, persuaded him to install like a little device in his office that just had a blinking light on it. It didn't do anything, but people started to think like that was some kind of secret communication device that that he was somehow talking to some high-placed source about. So, he was not above certainly misdirection in his stories. I don't think anything he wrote would pass, modern journalistic scrutiny. But most of his major stories that I was able to vet now, again, 100 years later, did check out at some level, some basic level of truth in there. And I think that was important to him, and he knew that things that had some truth to them were going to be more powerful in persuading people to see Germany as an enemy than if he just made stuff up out of whole cloth. I don't know, maybe he did do that. There are certainly stories that can't be vetted, and it's just unknown, like where he got things. But in places where I can we're now 100 years later, knowing what I know, reverse engineer the stories and figure out where they came from. A number of them were confirmed. I would confirm them at pretty high levels.
Yeah, because you had mentioned earlier too that some of the claims, like some of his writing, he would hear from like other spies. So I don't know if you were able to look into that, like really, like when you were reverse engineering some of his stories, like really where he was making these claims from, and if he actually was even believing, the causes that he was supporting in his writing.
Yeah, well, he was a true believer. I'm pretty sure, I'm positive of that. He was an absolute true believer. Again, he was a native Australian, which meant at the time he would have been born a British subject. So, Australia at the time being a dominion of Great Britain, in 1915-16, German and British troops were slaughtering each other in trench warfare in France, right? So I think he was a true believer from birth that, Great Britain was going to be on the side of the right. It's kind of funny, we think about it now, but it seems pretty obvious that the United States would be on Great Britain's side in a world war in the 20th century. But it wasn't that obvious in World War I. There were no Nazis, right? Who was the bad guy at the start of the war? It was kind of hard to say. I mean, Europe had wars all the time. I don't think at the very beginning people knew that this one would be something so different. There were, roughly 90 to 95 million Americans at the time. About 8 million of them were either German born or the son of German immigrants. So there's a lot of big base of German Americans. They certainly didn't want to go to fight, their homeland. There are tons of Irish Americans here, millions of Irish Americans here. After, roughly 800 years of strife with Great Britain, they didn't exactly want to go fight on the side of Great Britain. So at the beginning of the war, I think opinions were so mixed as to be neutral. And from the get-go in 1914, when the war broke out, President Wilson said the duty of every American is true neutrality in this war. Of course, the combatants, that's the last thing they wanted America to be, would be neutral, right? And they wanted America on their side, right? Germany, I don't think ever thought America would fight on its side, but if they could stop America from selling, American companies from selling and exporting weapons to Great Britain, that would be a big win for them. And that was sort of their goal, the goal of their propaganda and their espionage. Great Britain was sort of the opposite. They needed the weapons and materials to keep flowing. And, eventually they were hoping the United States would enter the war on their side. So Ratham was a true believer in that. And he saw America's resistance to war as an enemy, just like he saw the Germans as an enemy. And he set out to wear down that resistance slowly, like, the wind wearing down a mountain.
Yeah, and throughout all of his work, and I know, as you've been talking about, he was able to build up a reputation for himself. What really led to then more so his downfall and kind of when it all started to crack apart?
Great. No, I'm seeing this picture and it's like, it looks like I'm talking to you by campfire, right? It's getting dark. So Ratham's downfall, right? So again, I mentioned earlier how he had told all these lies in lecture circuit. He had taken credit for things that he didn't do. He had plagiarized the daring deeds of others and claimed them for himself. He also offended the Department of Justice by suggesting that they weren't doing their job because everywhere he went was saturated with German spies, right? So the Department of Justice, at the highest levels, starting with the Attorney General, a guy named Thomas Watt Gregory at the time. He was a Democrat working for Woodrow Wilson administration, which is Democratic. And he just decided it's time to shut Ratham's mouth. So he ordered that Ratham would be subpoenaed before a grand jury in New York. And these questions would be put to him under oath. And if he didn't have the evidence that he was telling the truth, then the grand jury could make a report and that would go public and that would destroy him. Ratham was mortified. He didn't want to testify. And he basically begged the Attorney General, is there anything I could do to get out of testifying? And the AG said, sure, just write me a confession, confessing to all the lies that you've told, sign it, and I'll hang on to it, and I'll keep it secret for as long as I think you're behaving yourself. And whether or not it stays secret is entirely up to the way you behave. So essentially, the Attorney General of the United States blackmailed a journalist into giving up his right to speak. And well, I mean, I just find this is just a real sobering part of the Ratham story, right? Again, he asked for it, certainly, he asked for it. And if he didn't tell all those lies on the lecture circuit, he wouldn't be handing the Department of Justice a club that they could hit him with. But still, this was the United States Department of Justice being leveraged in a purely partisan and personal way to shut up one loudmouth journalist from Providence, Rhode Island. And that gives us pause. That should give us pause. So Ratham's under extreme duress signed this confession in 1918. And it was, as Gregory said, he kept his word. He kept it quiet. Time went by. Ratham was a good boy for a year or so. And then 1920, he really got into it again. And this is where Ratham's knack for just getting into trouble with some of the most historic characters in American history really comes to bear. So there was a major scandal in the United States Navy in Newport, Rhode Island. The Navy brass there wanted to clean up the city because they had heard a lot of reports of sailors engaged in gay hookups in and around Newport. And again, remember, this is 1919 when this really began. This is kind of a primitive era. Gay people were treated as sex criminals and could be prosecuted and literally jailed for just being themselves. So they came up with a sting operation that was almost too stupid for words. And they recruited a bunch of young, good-looking sailors, many of whom were in their teens, sent them out under orders to infiltrate the gay underground of Newport and to have sex, if necessary, to gain evidence about who was having gay sex. And they did. And this group, in the pursuit of justice, this sting operation, this group of undercover infiltrators enjoyed vast quantities of oral sex and then wrote down the names of the men who gave it to them. They brought that back to the Navy. Those people were rounded up, prosecuted, and it was really a low point in the history of the U.S. Navy. The sting it got a little wider. It roped some civilians in. One of those civilians was an Episcopal priest from Providence, and he was tried in federal court in Providence and acquitted. And it was kind of a hard trial to cover when the newspapers at the time just wouldn't report the details of what he was accused of, right? So when he was acquitted, Ratham just lost it, and he attacked the Navy He attacked the Wilson administration, and he particularly attacked the guy who he thought was responsible, which was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, young upcoming politician named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ratham obviously couldn't have known that he was dealing with the premier politician of the 20th century. And getting into a scrap with Ratham Roosevelt was the dumbest thing that Ratham ever did. In 1920, most people don't remember this. I didn't even know this until I was doing this book. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party on the presidential ticket with the governor of Ohio, John Cox. So throughout the 1920s, this is an election going on. Well, Ratham and Roosevelt are sniping at each other over the Newport scandal and some other sort of similar scandals in other places. A week before the election, Ratham tried to destroy Roosevelt by making a bunch of charges about him. He sent a press release out to newspapers all over the country saying, "I, John Ratham, accused Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the following things." And some of these things were very serious. Some of these things were felonies. Roosevelt was, of course, upset about this. He was about to stand for national election in like a week. He called the Attorney General, Attorney General of the U.S. Attorney for New York and said, "Is there anything you can do to help me? Can you prosecute Ratham? Is there anything you can do?" He said, "No, I can't prosecute Ratham. There's something else I can do for you." And the Department of Justice released Ratham's confession to the press. In it was all his admissions of all the lies that he ever told, and it destroyed his reputation. Didn't help Roosevelt. The Democrats got shellacked in that election. Roosevelt sued Ratham for a massive $500,000 lawsuit, which was a massive suit at the time. It never went to trial because Roosevelt that summer developed polio. Ratham never had to face court depositions or being cross-examined because Roosevelt got polio. He let the suit die for lack of action because he had just much bigger problems. So that was how Ratham, this was 1921. He got sick in 1922 with cancer. He died in 1923 with his reputation largely shattered, and the writers of history decided to punish him by leaving him out.
Yeah, that's great. And kind of going back to his timeline of when he became a journalist and when he was, doing really well. Would you say that he's, the most famous journalist to ever work in Rhode Island? Because this is one of the questions from the chat. Does anyone else ever come close? And, he was a firm believer in the saying that, raise hell and sell papers. Was he, I guess, the most successful at the time, or is there any competition really?
I would argue that John Ratham Ratham was the most fascinating Rhode Islander in history. Wasn't a native Rhode Islander, but once he moved to Rhode Island in 1906, he never lived permanently anywhere else for the rest of his life. He's buried at Swamp Point, and actually an unmarked grave. There's no headstone. I've been to it. You can find it. You can get a cemetery where you do a map and help you find it, but never had a stone. He does not lie under a stone that says John Ratham, I think, because he didn't want to lie forever under a name that was a lie. But was he the most famous journalist? Certainly in his time. Certainly in his time, he was the most famous. He was one of the most famous journalists in America in his time. And I think the most fascinating Rhode Islander in history.
Yeah, and kind of, going off of what you were talking about earlier with him, being able to produce, a lot of these sensational stories and lies. Do you think that that helped with, people were more susceptible at the time, or, kind of touching upon how you had mentioned that a lot of people were scared? So I guess kind of does that play into what made people more susceptible, or are there like other factors?
It's funny because I had a question in another interview. Are we any better at recognizing lies and false propaganda than we were then. And I don't think so. I don't think we're any better. I mean, what percentage of this country believes, in the QAnon conspiracy? I mean, a pretty healthy percentage. So no, we're no better at, I don't think we're better at recognizing lies or conspiracies or propaganda. I think, in fact, we may be a little more hardy when facing it, because we face so much more of it, because so much more of it comes at us now from every direction. I mean, propaganda comes with, there's always somebody trying to affect how we think, whether it's Pepsi saying they're better than Coke, or Tide cleans better than all, or candidate says my opponent is a crook, right? So we're always having to make judgments as Americans about information coming at us that is trying to affect and change the way we think. I don't think we do a great job in total of sifting out things that are wrong or unsupportable.
Yeah, going off of that and kind of to close out with the last few questions, someone had asked kind of what drew you to the story and what lesson does it teach today's journalists? So kind of going into that with we're still susceptible in, the modern age to misinformation. What can we learn? And then, what journalists in general can learn from his work and his exploits?
Well, I can only say about that is, like, it is our duty just to be right and to care about being accurate and right and fair, right? But fair doesn't necessarily mean equal lies from both sides, right? I mean, that's not really fair. I mean, the thing we need to be fairest to is the truth, and that's what I think. That is our duty, right? And the Ratham story teaches us a lot of weird things, I think, but something I think we can take from it is, he, for all his faults and for all the fact that he, definitely would not survive a week under modern journalistic scrutiny, or under modern journalistic ethics, he did believe that at the center of his reporting, things had to be based on truth and not on just, what we might consider fairness, right? You get a say, you get a say. I mean, the truth should have a say in there somewhere. And I think that that's where our loyalty needs to be as journalists. It needs to be to the truth first. People have their different ways to spin it, perhaps, but not permitting lies to get into our copy that we know are lies. I mean, that's an important thing. Challenging people who we don't believe are telling the truth, and holding them to account. That's our job.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know if anyone else had any other questions for Mark, but that was one of the last questions we had for you in relation to, kind of tying it to modern journalism. So I guess to ask solely then about the book in general, do you hope to write more about these kind of stories, or do you think there'll be more development, or do you think this will be for now, because it's like a lot already covering a lot?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm going to write next. I used to write novels like in the early aughts, right? I haven't had a novel come out since like 2009. It's my first nonfiction book, The Imposter's War. I wrote a novel mostly on the train in 2019 before the pandemic, but there's something wrong with it, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. So I set it aside for a while. In the meantime, this project came up, and I just did this. This has been my obsession for quite a while. And now I've just started going back to that novel and, working on that a bit. I had an editor take a look at it that I know, and got some good advice. And so I'm going back to rework that and trying to diagnose the problems with it and, get it back into shape and see what it can do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't know if you have any questions for us, or I know I'm sure you want to hop off now and want to have dinner or something.
Look, I'm delighted to be here. I love talking about this. John Ratham and journalism are my two favorite subjects in the world. So really excited to have been able to talk about him. And, I hope everyone, you get the book, please. I encourage you to do it. It's very helpful, obviously, and I think you will like it. If you do like it, please share that information on social media or whatever. And if you don't like it, please keep that to yourself.
Yeah, awesome. Well, if no one, we'll definitely be buying the book. Yes, I definitely want to buy it now too. I'll definitely try. I don't have any classes tomorrow, at least in my journalism department, but I think next week I can definitely bring that up because we like to, talk about books that people are writing. So that'd be awesome. We'll definitely talk about that. So, but yeah, if no one else has any questions, I think we're all set here. But
thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. It's really nice.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Take care, all.